For the longest time, I'd always experienced creations on the other side of the screen, wondering what it would be like to see through their eyes. First-person games in general are the closest genre to provide that effect in my experience, and yet you're merely seeing what they're seeing through a fixed camera. VR in essence is like putting on a pair of glasses or goggles to shield the eyes from salty water or to just simply give you more clarity, except that when you put these goggles or glasses on, your eyes are in a way transported to another dimension, a digital realm so to speak, given birth by code and parameters. You move and look around without weight, your efforts only being the movement of your own body. These are the feelings that circle around my head when I hop into VR gaming, and here I will be going a little bit into my personal experience thus far. 5 months ago or so, I had finally decided to invest into buying a headset, the Oculus Quest 2, which at the time was the cheapest one that was also one of the best available. The price of the index wasn't something I was willing to bite the bullet with since this was going to be my first headset, so the Quest it was. My very first experience with VR was incredibly brief. A samurai game at a convention that I went to, all for the span of 5 minutes or so. Unfortunately, I can't remember it, and honestly, I wouldn't really count it as a proper VR experience, just due to the merit that I didn't really have enough time to sit down or stand up and play it. Where now that I have my own VR headset, I could take all the time that I needed. That first time experience wouldn't come until way after that convention, with my first full playthrough of SUPERHOT VR. SUPERHOT VR came out in the same year as the original SUPERHOT, which was a shooter where time stopped when you stopped moving. Its success made way for a VR adaptation later on in the same year of its release. This was also when the Oculus Rift came out, and the team behind SUPERHOT VR wanted to take the opportunity to be a part of the VR revolution that would come. And to be honest, SUPERHOT VR is so much better than the original. The time stop mechanic is exceeded by the unique measures that can be undertaken with the VR gameplay, making moves or meleeing in ways that would be impossible in conventional gaming. I was blown away by the sheer sense of awareness, looking around to only see a completely different environment that was not my own. The first time is breathtaking, amazing and surreal. To look around and interact with the virtual space was truly incredible the first time around. You could quite literally act without consequence for your own motion, using the controllers that come with the headset. You could fight without the risk of harm, run without the loss of your breath, walk butt naked through the coldest of realms, and so on. SUPERHOT VR for me was only the beginning of my exploration for many other titles. Resident Evil 4 VR was also another trip to another world. Resident Evil 4 is my favorite game in the entire series, and the VR adaptation revamps the experience where it is still essentially the same game, but controlled in a different manner. Being in the docks where the merchant is was simply breathtaking. Looking around the entire village, the castle, interacting with your weapons, key items and treasures felt magical. Capcom could have just as easily made it a camera-only VR game like they did with Resident Evil 7 for the PSVR, but no, you can do almost anything with full motion. It's a fantastic revamp and I highly recommend picking it up when you get your first VR headset. It's a must-buy. During the course of several years, a number of amazing titles for VR would also come out, like Boneworks, Blade & Sorcery, Vertigo Remastered, Into the Radius, Beat Saber, and many more. In 2020, the most impressive VR game that I had ever seen visually, Half-Life Alyx, would come out, and admittedly, I was down due to the fact that it was VR only. A part of me had hoped for a non-VR mod just so I could play, because initially, I wasn't that interested or willing to invest into a VR headset at the time. But I knew that playing it without the VR would have been a lesser experience since it was designed for VR in the first place, and was designed to push it forward in world building and storytelling, as well as other things, and to not just hold it back by finding compromises to make non-VR gamers be able to play it. After doing a full playthrough of the game, I could see now why it was so well regarded in its time, being a worthy addition to the Half-Life franchise. It's visually stunning, its attention to detail in both the world under the Combine rule, the return of the Vortigaunts, its accessible gameplay made it a fun ride, and also seeing the return of iconic characters was also a breathtaking moment when they appeared. And during my playthrough, I had managed to come across a VR mod for Half-Life 2 that came out not too long ago, and I cannot wait to dive into that. Besides Half-Life Alyx, I have also enjoyed many hours of Blade and Sorcery, a game where all your delusions of being a gifted knight or a powerful wizard come into virtual form. It's more or less a sandbox of sword fighting and magic casting, and it is highly moddable, from maps to combat overhauls, to entirely new magic spells and weapons. You can do almost anything you want here, even live out your Star Wars fantasy too if you wish, or play on maps that recreate areas from fucking Dark Souls, and even Falador from RuneScape. The physics and weapon handling here are responsive, and it's fairly gory, being able to decapitate enemies or turn their skin red with blood. Occasionally when I just want to wind down, I hop on this game with a shield, a spear, or an axe, a bow, whatever I want really, and pretend to know how to fight. Or, like I said, use a bow and pretend I know how to use it when I really don't. It's a lot of fun and can be customized in whatever way you see fit. Or you could just simply sit down with a sufficiently strong cup of mead by your side and watch the setting sun and not fight at all, and appreciate the efforts made by the devs to create an immersive fantasy experience. During my journey into VR, I had become pleasantly surprised, well, not pleasantly, but just surprised as to how difficult it was to actually aim. In conventional gaming, the weapon is always at a fixed angle. Your only concern is your crosshair placement and positioning. In VR, everything has to be taken into account. How you're holding it, how it's angled, whether it's straight or not, and of course the manual motion of reloading and aiming, as well as positioning. Where I'm from, we don't have access to a lot of firearms by official means. What we have is good enough for hunting, and that's about it really. But in a VR space, I can test virtually anything, and get the theory behind the anatomy and function of a weapon I may never get to use. For instance, in H3 VR, a gun simulator that lets you test a huge number of weapons, even going as far back to flintlocks and muskets, is the closest thing to simulating weapons in a virtual format. The attention to detail is incredible. Every aspect of the individual weapons are taken into account, and here I often just shoot at the target range maps and use whatever weapon comes to mind. I highly recommend picking it up if you're into this sort of thing. Aiming takes a lot of time to get used to, in whatever VR game that you play. And also, in regards to the screen, the optical lens and the blurriness is still something that you have to get used to and can be a deterrent for some of them, where they can't get over it, and altogether just drop it entirely. At first, I thought something was wrong, but then I looked more into it, finding all kinds of solutions to basically alleviate the blurriness. But then I found that it's been a consistent issue since the first Oculus Rift released. It's improved over time, but it still has a long way to go in regards to giving full clarity to one's vision. So unfortunately, it's not going to be like putting on a pair of prescribed glasses. I have tried getting my friends into VR with mixed success, and some failures of course. It's something that is easier said than done, and I find that the reason is because that it is something that is better experienced when you have the time for it, when you can just stand up or sit down and spend hours figuring out the motions of VR, figuring out the interfaces and how to play it. When you quickly rush someone into trying it out, they're not going to get the full experience, and then it's really up in the air whether they just enjoy it. Some of them have even said they would just rather play the mouse and keyboard, just play a game the regular way, rather than just doing all the motion stuff that you do in VR. And especially for someone that might have motion sickness, especially if you play a game like Boneworks, that in itself can be a deterrent and an ultimate turn-off for getting into VR entirely. VR gaming in general genuinely takes some time to get used to, and it's a very different experience from your usual type of gaming. Now, is VR perfect? No. In fact, it can sometimes be janky and frustrating. For something that emulates real-life motion, you would expect a seamless transition, where you can make effortless movements. But every game feels different, and physical space is a problem for many, actually just about everybody. There are, however, accessories that can enhance the experience altogether, and is something that I have considered myself, and will eventually get into, of course. Biting the bullet for a device is scary at first, but it really is worth it, and honestly, its potential has only really just started, thanks to games like Boneworks with amazing physics and interactivity, and Half-Life Alyx for its incredible world building and storytelling. Both in hand, with the best of both worlds, will pave the way for a number of other VR titles that continue to push the envelope forward. Other big companies have been nervous about investing into VR gaming due to how hard it is to actually develop a VR game compared to conventional games. And the player base, while fairly large, is nowhere near as big, since not everyone has a headset.
Yeah, just grab anything.
And a lot are not willing to buy one since it's fairly expensive, especially if you're looking at the Valve Index. However, some upcoming titles may just be what the VR industry needs to go forward, like with VAIL VR making a big push to become a competitive VR shooter, something along the lines of CSGO or Valorant or Rainbow Six Siege, the upcoming Horizon VR game that looks both beautiful and enticing, and from someone that enjoyed Zero Dawn, I'm keen to see their implementation of VR. Ubisoft themselves are finally having a go at it as well, with Assassin's Creed, another series I have fond memories of, Black Flag to be specific. But the combination of historical times and VR immersion, along with the opportunities to create unique assassinations like you can do with Hitman VR, will be really interesting. The more companies take a dive into the VR scene, the bigger VR itself can become, which is something that I hope for, since it will at some point become the conventional means of gaming, whether it's augmented reality or virtual. But that's not to say that I've ditched other types of games. VR is in no means a replacement. It's just another additional layer of gaming that I enjoy, alongside other types of games that I also play. I don't always play VR, especially not for long periods of time. It's an experience that I like to savor and take breaks with occasionally. Of course, I'll never be able to replicate the first time experience with the Oculus Virtual Space and SUPERHOT VR, but it's not something I'll get tired of either. Like anything in life, too much of something and you will inevitably get tired of it. I plan on getting into more detail with some of the VR games that I've already played. Other titles to pick up down the track like Bonelab, which looks really fun, as well as a number of other projects and other games that I have in mind. I'm glad that I bit the bullet for VR. It's a future that I endorse and will continue to support for the foreseeable future. Thank you for watching.